Emily. So I'm going to convene our meeting of the Planning Commission for Tuesday, August 23rd at 6:30. We have our quorum here with us. Just want to start off by welcoming our new member, Julia. It's nice to have you with us here. And why don't we just do some introductions around, since we do have a new member. I'll start. I'm Andy Montrol. I'm the chair of the Planning Commission. And I'll let people just go call out on their own. And Megan and Charles, you could join in unless you've already introduced yourselves. So who wants to introduce?
Hi, Julia. I'm Bruce Baker. I'm the vice chair.
Hello, Alex Friend, also a member of the Planning Commission.
Hi, Julia. Eves Bradley, a member of the Planning Commission. Nice to meet you and welcome.
Still have Emily. You're on mute. The one on mute is Emily Lee. She's a member also. And
hi, I'm Emily. Sorry, I just was away from. Hi.
And Michael, we have a new member, Julia. So we're just going around giving introductions of ourselves.
Hi, Julia.
It's Michael. And you've probably met Megan and Charles, I assume.
Charles and I have been emailing. I haven't gotten the chance to meet Megan yet. So.
All right.
Yeah. Good to see you, Julia. I'm Charles. I'll be working pretty closely with you, so welcome.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you for the, oh, go ahead, Megan. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say I'm the planning director, Julia. So nice to meet you. And thanks so much for volunteering to join the Planning Commission.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here. It's an honor, and I'm excited to get to know this group and learn from you all. Is it okay if I introduce myself a little bit more?
Yes, of course.
So I've lived in Burlington for 1.5 years and have loved living here. And I've worked with SE Group, a planning and design firm, for 2 years as a community planner. I work in the community and recreation planning team. I mostly work on comprehensive plans, area plans, affordable housing, site analysis projects, and code analysis projects. And mostly those projects are in the context of communities that have a recreation economy, like a big asset like a ski area or a bike park. And I've done work in Vermont, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. So I don't actually get to do very much work in Burlington. I'm a member of the Letty Park Comprehensive Plan right now. But other than that, I really don't get to do very much where I live. So I'm really excited about this opportunity to learn about planning in Burlington and apply some of the things that I've learned from other communities. And then I also, in addition to some of the more traditional planning stuff, I also do some permitting things like Act 250 permitting and Section 248 permitting for solar energy projects. So I do have that context as well. But yeah, and I got into planning because I'm from Albany, New York, and I see some maybe smiles. Albany has a lot of urban renewal impacts, and as I got older, I sort of realized how that had shaped my experience growing up there and my peers' experiences there. And so I'm really passionate about correcting past wrongs in planning and using the tools of planning to do that today. So I'm really excited to be joining this group, and thanks for the opportunity to introduce myself.
Great. Again, really glad you're here. And as we go along, a lot of the time, as we go forward from here, we're going to be in the middle of things that we've been talking about before. So if you have any questions along the way, just feel free to interrupt and ask your questions. It probably will help all of us to get caught up on some of the things that we're talking about as well. So with that, let me turn to our agenda and start with our agenda,
Andy,
which, yes,
can I just say a quick word?
of course.
If you don't mind, Julia, I'm just saying I'm impressed that you're an actual planner in addition to Megan and Charles as a member of the Planning Commission. And also that you want to talk more about planning in addition to your day job. So I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, she gets a gold star for being willing to volunteer her nights in addition to her days, right?
We talk about planning and zoning at night. That's the key part.
Oh, I know. I'm frequently on planning commission meetings and preparing things for other planning commissions. So if it ever, happens that I'm in multiple planning commissions meetings in a week, that'll be a little tough to contend with, but I'm ready. So
Yeah, you'll always have to remember whether you're helping advise or you're voting. So which side you're going to be on. But
I feel like
great.
it'll be more fun to vote. Just
Oh, it is. It's a lot of it's very good. So are there any changes to our agenda
None have
Oh.
been proposed by staff.
other than the first two items were canceled, which was the
that's
tour,
correct.
but all right, then we have our agenda as proposed. The next item, item 4, is the public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to us on pretty much any item that you'd like to. Charles, do we have anyone who wants to speak to us?
We do. We have a list of folks. So we're going to start with Barbara Hedrick. And then from there in the chat, I will start a queue. If you would like to speak, if you can use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. We'll start with Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome, Julia. So last week, I didn't realize that the tour of the Trinity campus was canceled, and I was over there. And when no one showed up, I just walked around myself. And it was very helpful. And I saw that there's this pretty steep hill between the Villa building where UVM plans events and Delaney Hall. Delaney Hall is the undergraduate dorm that they plan to keep in place. And that hill really is where the yellow blob is on the UVM sketch that says where the new undergraduate dorm will go. So I posed a question via email earlier this week about height measurements, and Lisa indicated that 80 feet height measurement could be anywhere on that building, bottom, like the low elevation at the bottom of the hill, or hypothetically, because she said it's flexible, depends on what the city decides. I interpret that as meaning 80 feet could optionally also be at the top of the hill. And because the hill is at least 25 feet tall, an 80-foot tall building at the top of the hill is very different from one that's 80 feet starting at a lower grade. So I think it would be helpful to include in the zoning amendment where the 80 feet is going to be measured. And what is the height going to be on the west wall? So if the downhill side is the east wall, and that's 80 feet, what's the west wall going to measure? Because you sometimes nowadays in cities, you have buildings that aren't necessarily flat roofed, or the walls aren't necessarily the same plane once they reach the top. So I think that would be important to know from an aesthetic viewpoint, exactly how tall is that going to look when you're on Colchester Avenue and looking at it. Two is, I'm wondering if UVM can tell us, is that hill going to be dug out to create a level base? Third is, I referenced a slide that UVM and the planning department showed in the last meeting, and it has all these different lines that show the 35-foot setback, the 115-foot setback, and the 150-foot building facade line. And what's really interesting is Delaney Hall, the front of Delaney Hall is at 150 feet back setback. And the yellow area that UVM says it's going to build is also 150 feet back. So I'm wondering, why are we asking for the setback to be 115 feet when UVM is telling us in the sketch that the building will be no closer than 150 feet to the road or the property line, whatever that facade line is, wherever it's measured? It seems to me that there's no reason to build a zoning amendment that's more generous than what UVM is asking for, because having that inconsistency leads to potential surprises where we'll end up with something different than what's in this sketch. Fourth, I don't understand why we're suggesting in the Trinity campus zoning amendment allowed use for structured garage when UVM has told us explicitly it has no plans for new parking on the Trinity campus. And doing my little walk around, there really isn't space for more parking unless it's under a building or underground. So again, I'm wondering why the inconsistency between what UVM is telling us they're going to do and what we're including in the zoning amendment. And likewise for single family homes, there's nothing in the UVM plan that mentions having single family homes on the Trinity campus. Why is that included in the zoning amendment? The idea is to maximize the number of student houses or dorms on the Trinity campus. And all along, I've been told that this is being tailored just for the Trinity campus. It's not laying the groundwork for use in other parts of campus. So I don't see a reason to make it different than what UVM is suggesting here. All right, thanks so much for your time and considering my comments.
Thank you, Barbara.
So Andy, we do have other folks attending the meeting, but it looks like nobody else would like to speak. If you would like to speak, please use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. Looks like nobody would like to speak, Andy, so I think we're good to go.
All right, then we'll close the public forum and we're on to the chair's report, which I guess I already gave mine in welcoming Julia, so we'll move on to the director's report. Megan.
All right, thank you, Andy. So one quick item that we wanted to get some feedback from the commission on is about the fact that we had to cancel tonight's visit. For those of you that weren't on when we said this, we were talking about making the call today and knew that if we canceled, the weather would clear up, and if we didn't, the weather would be crummy. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So we have thought about and connected with UVM to propose that we could reschedule our intended site visit for 5 p.m. on Tuesday, September 13th, which is before our next Planning Commission meeting. So wanted to just take a second to poll all of you to see if at least several of you would be able to make that time work, so we can decide whether to reschedule to that point.
How is that for everybody? Do you want to just give a thumbs up or not?
What was the date again? Can you say that again?
Tuesday, September 13th, and it would be at 5.
I will not be able to make it.
Okay.
I'm in.
I can do that.
So
Okay.
it's seems like it's good for most people. Michael, will you be at our next meeting?
I can make the meeting. I'll just be traveling back, so I won't be able to.
Okay.
Okay.
I can't make this 13th.
Okay, so it sounds like we have at least 4 people, which I think is a good critical mass if others that can't make it are okay with us moving forward. So we'll plan for that. And then I think the other piece that we wanted to get the commission's feedback on, just so that we can make sure we appropriately plan for what will really be a pretty short period of time that we can be out there, is whether there are specific questions that you're hoping to gain insights about by going on the site visit. So, I mean, it's fine if your interest is really in just kind of generally understanding the campus a little bit better, but I know that UVM actually, in anticipation of tonight's tour, had done some flagging and marking of the different property lines and setback lines that we've been talking about so that we can see what they look like in the real world. But wanted to check in with you to see if there were any other specific questions you might hope to have answered.
For me, I think what you just described, Megan, is pretty much what I was looking for. Just the general layout and some of the markers of where some of the setbacks might be, just to get more familiar with it. How about other folks? Anyone different than that? Or want something more specific? Bruce?
I think we've had a little discussion on the street perspective. I think that's really important because it is kind of a gateway to Burlington from that side, from Winooski anyway. And I think how buildings meet the street and meet the walkers along the street, along the sidewalk is important, and people who drive in.
Good, thanks. Anyone else?
I wanted to say the same thing as Bruce. I agree, circulation and more pedestrian infrastructure, how that would factor into the site. I'm interested in learning about that.
Okay, great. So, we had also planned to take a look at some of the slope questions that you heard during the public forum. So we'll make sure that we connect with Lisa Kingsbury from UVM about trying to hit those points. So
Perfect.
then, yeah, I'd say for those of you that can make it, plan to join us at 5 p.m. on September 13th, and we'll make sure that that is noticed as part of our upcoming agenda. The other item that I wanted to update the commission on is something that I know some of you have been kind of, I almost said in the weeds on, which feels very punny, but some of you have been involved in questions around cannabis and the legalization of cannabis in Burlington. So I just wanted to give the commission a quick update on what the rollout of retail cannabis will look like for Burlington. If you're not aware, in the spring of 2021, the voters were actually asked whether they wanted to opt in to allowing retail cannabis establishments within the city of Burlington. And overwhelmingly, voters voted in favor of enabling retail establishments in the city. Under the new state laws for the kind of different the different cannabis establishment types, this was the only establishment type that the voters were asked about, the retail establishments. So we were not given the option to opt in or out for cultivators or growers or manufacturers and producers. So the state has specifically said for those establishment types, as well as for the retailers, now that we have said yes to them, we cannot pass laws through zoning or other parts of our ordinance that have the effect of prohibiting those establishments from locating in the city. After a lot of discussion and kind of sifting through lots of information from the state about what municipal authorities can look like and what municipalities are prohibited from doing, the council a couple of weeks ago passed a resolution to establish a local cannabis control board that will be the city's first and kind of primary mechanism for actually reviewing license applications for all cannabis establishments that come through the state, and kind of giving our sign off on them at the local level. That local review will really help us just ensure that these establishments are complying with our local zoning rules, that they have, for example, talked to our water department or wastewater department to make sure that there is adequate capacity to service, especially cultivators and manufacturing operations, and just general compliance with things like our sign ordinance and other areas of the city's existing ordinances. There are kind of relatively few new authorities that the city has for regulating cannabis establishments outside of things like zoning or kind of public health aspects. So on the topic of zoning, I think we just wanted to make sure that the commission kind of understood, especially since we haven't talked about this at the commission level, that the city's approach for this at the outset will be that cannabis establishments will be regulated as whatever the kind of closest use they would be if they were not a cannabis establishment. So what I mean by that is retailers will be regulated as retail. Cultivators will be regulated depending on kind of how the business manifests, will either be regulated as, agriculture or manufacturing potentially. Processing will be regulated as some form of manufacturing. So We've been working with the Department of Permitting and Inspections to actually create a kind of crosswalk table that identifies each of the state's cannabis license types and how local Burlington zoning will permit them under our existing zoning standards. The other piece of the new, well, I should say the other piece of the state's kind of infrastructure around cannabis establishments is compliance with the state's drug-free school zone laws. And that is something that's sort of independent actually of cannabis establishments specifically, but is applicable as these new retailers start to open, which prohibits the sale of a controlled drug, a regulated drug within 500 feet of a school. So in addition to providing guidance for how different license holders will understand what kind of zoning permit to apply for, we have also put together a map that shows buffer zones around each of the schools in the city to help applicants understand areas in which they could or may be prohibited from opening a cannabis retailer. So those are the main points that I wanted to share with all of you, just so that you understand kind of how this will be rolling out. The state has already been issuing licenses for all of the license types other than retailers, but can begin issuing licenses for retailers beginning on October 1st. So we're not sure kind of how soon we may see applications in Burlington. We have had a number of inquiries, but we can keep you up to date as we actually see how kind of rollout of this goes. And as we shared with council, as we see how the rollout of this goes, we may also consider some additional local regulations or changes to our regulatory environment if necessary to address issues that we're seeing. So that is what I wanted to share with you about that. Michael?
Great, thank you. Then we'll close the director's report and move on to item 7, which is proposed CDO amendment, South End Innovation District overlay.
Andy, I do think Michael had a question maybe about the cannabis report. Is it okay to answer any questions?
It's
Sorry, I
obviously
missed that.
it's obviously a rich subject. So this is just on background, understanding that we could have a whole hour devoted to this. But is this statute, does it restrict land use or restrict our ability to regulate land use other than the school issue?
This is an area that we have spent a lot of time trying to work through and get clarity on. So at this point, I will say maybe. In particular, related to the buffers, the state's Cannabis Control Board has actually published guidance that specifically says that municipalities may not create buffer zones that apply only to cannabis retailers. We do not necessarily agree with that interpretation of the state enabling legislation for zoning, but in working with them, it remains a gray area. And I think a lot of communities across the state are really struggling with the way that the guidance has been written and how it's interpreting zoning authorities, and whether and how many tools municipalities actually have to kind of get more fine grain with their land use policies for cannabis.
Megan, along those lines, are we able to regulate, like, whether you could put them in, residential neighborhoods, put them in parks, put them in places like that, that may not be near schools, but just non-commercial areas of the city?
I believe so. Through the state's laws, you can designate what zoning districts cannabis establishments can be located in. And this is one of the reasons why we had recommended or had talked about the fact that we could utilize a lot of our existing zoning framework, because we have set up zoning districts that enable certain uses to happen in certain zoning districts in the city. So we felt that that was a very strong foundation for retailers opening that gives some guardrails to the kinds of locations.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks. Any other questions for Megan? Sorry, I missed yours, Michael. I don't think I see any, so we'll go on now to the um, South End Innovation District overlay discussion. And I think, Charles, are you picking this one up?
Yes, I will take this. This is a very detailed amendment that you've got in front of you. So Megan, if you would like to jump in, please do. I will generally start by saying we've prepared a presentation that I will run through. It is fairly closely aligned with the draft amendment that is included in your packet, although it's not perfect. And so I will run through the presentation. If any of you would like to pause at any point to have a discussion about that particular topic, feel free. I can also alternatively run through the presentation and then we can talk about the amendment in order. It's sort of up to you and we can decide as we go. Before I start to share my screen, just want to say a few things that we probably haven't said in the past couple of meetings that we have presented this amendment to you in. And the first is that, you know, we have said that Plan BTB South End was the sort of genesis of the idea of an innovation district in the South End. Very strong community support throughout that planning process. For the creation of an innovation district that would primarily do a few things that would protect and foster the growth of the arts and manufacturing sector in the South End, while also fostering the burgeoning office sector in the area. And we have said a few times that housing was sort of specifically not recommended in the plan. However, it's really important to note that this iteration of the Innovation District and as it's presented to you has its foundation in one of the plan's recommendations to really continue a discussion about housing in the South End. And so that's where we are. We've sort of painted that narrative for you. And so I can go ahead and give the presentation. Perhaps just a little bit more on the memo itself. And so because the plan did call for that continued discussion about housing, there has been, you know, quite a lot of engagement. You know, this amendment itself was proposed by Hula and property owners in the Lakeside area in 2021. That really started a discussion that resulted in a memorandum of understanding that was signed by the city, various departments in the city, Champlain Housing Trust, property owners, and other important stakeholders. And then the final piece of the public engagement has been the work that the planning department has coordinated with other city departments over the last few months. Again, we've been out to Ward 5 a few times, had a few public meetings, and engaged with stakeholders over the last 4 or 5 months. So that's where we are. Just moving down the memo, just so everybody's clear here, the proposed amendment does a few things. It amends Article 4. It would establish the South End Innovation District and amend the map to create that overlay. It creates new land use standards in the district and urban form standards to sort of guide the physical development of the district. Because it is using some terms that are not already defined in the CDO, we'll have to provide some definitions and have to apologize today that those definitions are not present, but they are forthcoming. If you want to have a discussion about those, specifically, I'm talking about bowling alleys, mass timber construction, passive house construction, and some specific types of green stormwater infrastructure, namely constructed wetlands, pervious pavement, and suspended pavement. And the last thing it does is amends the use table. So without further ado, if there's no questions right now, I'll jump into my presentation. And again, if you want to stop and have the discussion about any topic at that time, just let me know. Okay, All right, everybody can see my screen. Okay, so again, the primary question here coming out of Plan BTP South End is how can the city utilize these vacant, underutilized spaces in the South End to create new space for a mixed-use district that creates space for makers, the artist community, and homes. Importantly, augmenting and sort of strengthening the area's environmental and economic resilience is at the core of the Innovation District. So again, you've all seen this. Julia, maybe you have not, but this is the proposed boundary as it stands today. It has been the working boundary for a number of months, really since the conversation around the Innovation District has been going on. We did engage the community, and we have spoken at length about the boundary with stakeholders and internal partners in the city. And this has remained the boundary throughout. There have been discussions about expanding or contracting the boundary, but this boundary has sort of stayed resilient throughout the time, and it itself is up for discussion. So if any of you would like to sort of engage that discussion about the boundary, please do. So again, won't spend too much time on this, but Plan BTP South End really did call for this area to be rezoned and re-envisioned as an innovation district. And since that time, the housing crisis has really come to the fore, not just in Burlington, but nationally. And this predates my time in Burlington, but I understand that the community discussion around housing in the South End has really changed considerably. And I would say that just in our engagement with the community, there's been very, very strong support for more housing. And I think this is backed up by the mayor's housing plan, the MOU. And you can just see here, the Housing as a Human Right Action Plan really adds a new element to that innovation district. So the structure of this presentation begins with a conversation around land use, and then we'll get into urban form standards. And that's a bit reversed from the way you see it in your draft amendment, but we really feel that this land use question is really at the core of this discussion here. So let me present this about land use, and then maybe let's have a discussion about what we're proposing as permitted, not permitted, and in a more limited fashion. So the land use concept generally breaks down into three categories, and those are permitted, limited, and not permitted. A general sort of approach has been to incorporate as many of the existing permitted uses into the new innovation district while limiting or not permitting some of those uses that are simply not consistent with residential use in an urban mixed-use district. So within the permitted use category, we've got four types of sort of land uses. So residential, arts and making, office, and community. And by community, we mean things like childcare centers, libraries, schools, that sort of thing. In the limited category in the middle, these are uses that are while not necessarily foundational to the innovation district or the concept of an innovation district, they are important to the fostering of a convenient urban lifestyle and a set of amenities for folks who are living and working and visiting the innovation district. And those really break into two sort of subcategories: convenience and service, and entertainment and amenity. And I'll talk about those in just a second. In the not permitted category, there's really three. And so heavy manufacturing, logistics, and others, those include obviously heavy manufacturing uses that are producing, using, or creating noxious waste, chemicals that again are not really consistent with a mixed-use neighborhood in a city. Tourism is in this not permitted category. And Michael did send an email about this, and we actually have had a good bit of discussion about hospitality uses and whether or not to propose them in the innovation district. So would love to hear folks' thoughts on tourism uses and then residential uses. So there's a host of residential uses that we propose should not be permitted in the innovation district, single family housing really being the one that sticks out. So I'll run through permitted residential uses, and with each of these and throughout this presentation, we try and sort of provide a rationale for why these approaches are proposed. So comes as no surprise that attached multifamily dwellings are proposed. This is envisioned as a mixed-use, dense urban district. And so this would include anything from row houses at the lowest scale, townhouses, row houses, up to large-scale apartment buildings. We can talk about, and you've received the public engagement summary. We did engage with the community about different housing types, and there really was broad support for that spectrum of housing, everything from row houses up to large apartment buildings. And so if you wanted to learn more about what we heard and what we've discussed with stakeholders, you can take a look at that engagement summary as well. In addition, co-housing, assisted living, convalescent nursing home, and group home. So this really is meant to make sure that the innovation district is an equitable community. It is an urban district that is for all Burlingtonians. It doesn't really need much more description. But if you would like to ask questions about what these specific uses are, what they entail, happy to have that discussion. And emergency shelter is one that we've included, just given the likelihood that there will be large sort of undeveloped or underutilized sites in the innovation district boundary for some time, emergency shelter is proposed. And then here in the blue box, you can see that the inclusionary zoning requirement is proposed at 15%. Given the very large size of some of these parcels, a 15% IZ requirement could and likely would produce hundreds of affordable units. So in the arts and making category, we're trying essentially to capture the entire universe of land uses that would support an arts community in the South End. I should say, relating to the previous slide, that throughout our engagement and with the community and arts stakeholders, we've heard that housing is in fact probably the most important need for artists in the South End and really in the city of Burlington today. It's a well-known fact that many artists and other makers are finding it hard to make a living, to reside in Burlington. And so housing is definitely a need and a use that we propose to support the arts and making community. But again, this list here really tries to capture all of the uses that are taking place in the arts and making community today. So everything that is happening at Generator, everything that is happening up and down Pine Street would be permitted in the Innovation District.
And Charles, if I could just add on one additional comment, I'm glad that you noted some of the things that we heard about residential being such an important piece of having a successful South End making district, whether that making is art and sort of manufacturing in the way that the district has known it, or making in the sense of the more high-tech making that we've seen really evolve in the district in the more recent years. I think one important nuance that we have heard as part of this discussion is that kind of along with that high level of support for reconsidering this question about residential uses in the South End, we've heard people say that for them, it feels easy to support this because we're largely talking about a boundary, an area of the South End where little has been happening in recent years. We're talking about either vacant parcels, large surface parking lots that I think a lot of people recognize could have a much higher value use for. And that, in general, there was a feeling that this could be an opportunity for the introduction of residential uses to act as a complement to the other activities that are happening in the neighborhood, rather than some of the concerns that we heard back in 2014, where there was a fear about displacement and gentrification. So I think it's a couple of things. It's one, kind of the specific area we're talking about, and two, the sort of changing and heightening of the housing crunch and how it's really affecting people who are trying to make the South End a home today who aren't able to do it because of the lack of actual housing. So.
Thanks, Megan. So office, similarly, this captures the universe of office types and uses that are happening today in the South End and potentially could be happening. This, if generally innovation districts as they exist around the country typically have a good mix of private sector partnerships between the public and private sector and educational institutions and healthcare. And so this would really set up a framework for any of those types of users to come into the innovation district and establish themselves. So if any of the universities in Burlington or elsewhere in Vermont wanted to establish a foothold in the innovation district, R&D, research labs, that sort of thing would help them. Hula, office, all types of work happening at Hula. And so again, this generally supports that office community that is already happening and is quite strong in the innovation district. Just a word, the last time we presented the concept for the amendment, we heard some discussion about the office market in Burlington and more specifically in the South End. And so we did a little bit of research of our own on how that office market is looking today in the wake of the pandemic. And so Allen Brooks and Minor, this is the 2021 report, does have some interesting takeaways. You can see that the non-central business district vacancy rates has fallen pretty significantly from a peak in 2020 of almost 10%. That's similar to what we've seen citywide, but you can see that this non-downtown related office market is appearing a bit stronger at the time. And Hula actually accounts for a significant portion of the office space outside of downtown and a significant amount of the office space that has been constructed in Chittenden County in the last 3 years.
Can you qualify what the central business district is?
Yeah, I think it is just downtown. Megan, if you know
It's generally downtown. Yeah.
Okay.
Generally downtown. So this would not, so the South End would not be in that area. But you can also just generally see how Burlington and non-CBD is matching up with the rest of the communities in the county. I know we heard some discussion from Eves and Michael last time in July about this. If you'd like to sort of speak about this right now, it may be a good time just to talk about the strength of the office market and what you see. If not, I'll go ahead and continue.
I can speak to it a little bit if you'd like.
Yeah, thanks.
What we're seeing is that spaces that are below 5,000 square feet remain relatively active. I think the rationale for that is that those are typically companies that are not nationals, or if they are nationals, the offices are small enough that there's independence. The larger spaces, which are typically owned, so Cox Automotive, for instance, dealer.com, there's very few people that are back to work because they need to enact sort of a corporate policy that's a blanket policy across the board due to COVID. And what's also happened is, it's very interesting, it's sort of catch-22, but people have gotten used to remote working over the pandemic. And particularly in the tech sector, there's been some significant resistance to coming back to the office. And with the labor market and the hiring market in the state that it is, companies don't have a choice but to accede to, you know, a relatively limited in-office policy. So the large spaces, so for instance, I've got 18,000 square feet at the Innovation Center, and no one's looked at it in 3 years. No one. You know, if it were cut into 3 or 4 smaller spaces, I could have leased them all up. But a space of that size doesn't really work. I will say there is a trend, and I don't mean to be an alarmist, but there is a little bit of a trend that we're beginning to see with companies when their leases are up. 2 things. One, the nationals are looking to reduce their square footage footprint by roughly 50% and to sign up for a shorter term deal. So if they've got a 5-year option, they're trying to negotiate for a 2-year option, maybe a 3-year option, with the idea being that literally they want to see how this labor market shakes out and what the ground looks like 2 or 3 years from now. So there's a lot of uncertainty. The other piece, and again, I have to say it, and I'm sorry to say it, but it's the truth, is that we're beginning to see some flight from the central business district with businesses who are frankly unhappy with the state of the city, particularly the inner core of the city. Employees not feeling safe, particularly when it gets darker earlier. And so that's actually been relatively good news for the South End, because the South End is still a Burlington address, but it doesn't come with, having to go to a parking garage and a lot of the attendant issues that we've seen in the central business district. That's enough from me.
Thanks, Yves.
Thanks, Yves.
Yeah, I think just to kind of tie a bow on this, our discussion in the last year, and it sounds like it's kind of almost a non-issue now that you've had the community feedback on the importance of residential in this development, was addressing the feasibility of essentially office or office-like development. And I was able to get my hands on actually a more recent version of this report, and at $15 to $20. Sorry, 1 second. The rents just aren't there. It doesn't seem to me to support new development, and that was kind of the centerpiece of our discussion and thinking about future new construction land uses in this area. The other thing that I'd add in conversations I've had in the year since is that the conversion, not that it can't be done, but the conversion of existing office space to residential, if you have a fairly well occupied building, is very expensive. It's almost like, it's not like, to the T building a new building, but it tends to be in a cost realm of substantial rehabilitation. It's very difficult. So I think that serves as some preservation of the existing office. But that was the general tenor of things. And it seems like the discussion has moved towards a residential discussion anyway, as folks being more open to that. But I just kind of wanted to tie that all together.
Well, and I appreciate you bringing that up, Michael, because I think that there has still been some nuance on that point specifically. So I think the conversation you were referencing is whether, as we think about opening up new residential uses, whether, this maybe should be limited to new construction only, or if we should be further limiting some of the sites that this new overlay could be applicable to. And I would say we've heard some mixed feedback about that issue still. In attending the South End Arts and Business Association's annual meeting, they made the point to say that, to really underscore the point that they feel really strongly in favor of new construction hosting residential uses, and they feel very protective of any existing commercial spaces being preserved for non-residential use. We have heard that kind of sentiment expressed by some of the stakeholders that Charles mentioned on the MOU that we've worked with. Others have said, let residential be residential. So I do think that this is still an issue that we need to wrestle through as a commission, is kind of where we will land on whether or not we should have any more nuance to the residential uses in this district going forward.
Yeah, and just to say that a little differently, we've not proposed that residential uses are restricted to new buildings. If you think they should be restricted to new buildings, given the office situation, we can amend the amendment to reflect that. So moving along, community uses are another type of use within this permitted category. And so again, adult daycare, community center, library, and school. Again, this is just a reflection that the Innovation District really should be a truly mixed use district that is, functioning or providing all the uses in the city that folks need to live a life. So again, we've got these two sort of subcategories in the limited land use category. So convenience and service, this is everything from, animal grooming, your vet, pet store, that sort of thing, pharmacy, to tailor. So again, these are urban conveniences, while not necessarily core to the function or intent of the Innovation District, they are important in a mixed use district. And again, I should say here that in your agenda packet, toward the bottom of the amendment is the land use table. And we're proposing that these limited uses be limited such that the total square footage of all of these limited uses cannot be any more than the total square footage of the non-residential uses in that permitted category. So for example, I know we've just spoken about office, but let's say there's 50,000 square feet of space developed in that permitted category. So let's say half of it is office and half of it is a daycare. So 25,000 of each. So in order to then develop an equivalent 50,000 square feet of these limited use categories, you would have to have those 50,000 square feet of office and daycare. If you only had 20,000 square feet in that permitted category, you would then only be permitted 20,000 square feet in this limited category. And the intent there is really to prevent the district from moving too far away from its core intent of, fostering the office economy, fostering the arts and maker community, and not becoming, simply a district with entertainment, other, restaurants, that sort of thing, amenities. But we do think they are important to the function of the Innovation District.
And one thing to just note for those of you that have been on the commission for a couple of years, the concept that Charles was describing should be familiar, as it was an approach that we first implemented into the South End down south of Home Ave, as we were considering allowing for entertainment facilities on Industrial Parkway. So this kind of idea of saying, there's a bucket of uses that we feel serve the primary purpose of this district and can be there in a sort of unlimited way. That's great. But these other things that can really support and go along with it, we will permit, but on a more limited basis.
Yep. So the other sort of, to round it out, the other limited categories are entertainment and amenities. So this is restaurants, multiple types of restaurants actually. And maybe now is just a good time to remind you that in our work plan, we intend on revising the use tables to simplify them. So you're seeing a lot of very specific uses that possibly in the future may be condensed. But for now, we're showing them as they are in the use table. So, restaurants, cinema, these are the things that make the Innovation District a nice, lively, fun place to live and be. So not permitted in the residential use category, single detached dwellings, duplexes. We did have some discussion, internally and with the community about duplexes, ultimately decided against them. Doesn't really meet the intent of the sort of density goals of the innovation district. Bed and breakfast, community house, historic inn. There are no historic inns today. Mobile home park and sorority and fraternity. So tourism, hotels are not proposed to be permitted. We have had quite a bit of discussion. And again, Michael, raised the point earlier today in some emails or in an email about this, that it could be important and even critical to the function of the innovation district to have some hospitality use in the South End. And whether that's a traditional hotel or something less traditional, sort of extended stay type of place where, let's say, Hula is recruiting a business or Innovation Center is recruiting a business, and they want to bring some folks into town for a month to see what Burlington is all about, and if their business is a good fit, they might want to be within the core of the innovation district. And so we've had a discussion about that type of use. We probably need to hammer out the details of what that looks like if the commission ultimately does decide that it would like to see some hospitality or tourism uses. But I know that's a discussion there's probably not complete agreement on in the commission. So we'd love to hear conversation about that. Looks like Eve's got your hand up.
Eve's running, go ahead.
Multiples of you have your hands up, so why don't you just go ahead?
Did you want to speak?
Eves, we can't hear you if you were trying.
Well, let's go to Michael. Did you want to speak?
Yeah, I thought I'd just reveal to the rest of the commission the email that I sent to Charles and Megan, which essentially was this. I think the way I'm looking at hospitality, it's not through the lens of tourism at all. In fact, a lot of hotels, tourism is only a fraction of their total business model. And so it's really more about business or business-like travel. And so my thinking here is, I've always thought from day one, this looks a lot like the analogy I always thought was like the Boulder Transit Village, where you have this focus of transit, except our transit is a larger area down to New York, particularly with the Amtrak. I really think that's an important connection for us. And so if you're to think about innovation, it's the sharing of ideas. I think the introduction and the acceleration of remote work to, amenity-friendly places like Burlington is real. And so you can see a world where there's quite a bit of connection between a place like New York City and Burlington, where people are going back and forth between whatever hub their company happens to have in either location. And so, to facilitate that knowledge sharing and that transportation back and forth through rail, which runs right through the site, and in fact is being studied right now, some sort of limited hospitality use, I think is important, particularly when you consider the fact the city has a policy that Airbnb is detrimental to affordable housing, and that oftentimes provides a location for extended stay. So I don't think it should be a big part of the site, but I think it can be creatively incorporated and meet the objectives as this location as a place for innovation and economic activity.
Great, thanks. Eves, did you want to try again?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I was going to say was, one of the things that I really do hear on a regular basis from the people who are working down in the South End is how much they appreciate the fact that there are, all the breweries.
You're breaking up.
Eves, we're losing you.
We don't hear you now. Sorry, Eve, sorry. Oh, there you're back again briefly.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can.
So I don't know how much you missed, but the demand and the appreciation for recreational activities, right now it's primarily breweries and some restaurants. But, I point to what's being planned for the Maltex site, the land that's adjacent. So it's a bowling alley and it's a spa. And, those are uses that I think should be allowed in this district, because what it does is it keeps people within that sort of walkable neighborhood, workable neighborhood. I do think we need to be careful on how we plan it. But I think that there needs to be that component, because what you don't want is to suggest to people that they need to get in their cars and go elsewhere to recreate. That's what sort of brings everything full circle, at least in my opinion.
Great. Thank you for that comment. Anyone else? I don't really see anybody. I can't see everybody because of the screen share. If anyone else has something to say, go ahead.
I don't.
Okay. All right. Back to you,
So,
Charles, then.
no, thanks for those comments, Michael and Eve. So I think what we're hearing is we may want to look at specifically with these uses, whether or not they should be in that limited or permitted use categories. And generally, I think more philosophically, how the commission feels about the approach for limited uses, and should it be no more than no more than the square footage of the permitted uses, or should it be a different number? I think that's a discussion we'll need to have going forward. So obviously don't need to spend too much time on this.
Sorry, Charles, really quick, before you get into the non-permitted, I wanted to offer just one additional perspective about the kind of approach to limiting and the question that you just posed. Understanding that this has been an issue that the commission has cared a lot about in previous discussions. I think it's important to just note that we're trying to take, both in this land use discussion as well as in the form standards that Charles will talk about, we're trying to take a much lighter touch to thinking about some of these issues than we have in other places. The question has come up before about, should we just treat this as a full-blown form code and not care about the uses at all? But I think kind of given the history and the evolution of this part of the city, we still care a lot about what the uses are, but we're trying to thread the needle between a completely hands-off approach and kind of a micromanaged approach. So that's where we've landed at this point with the kind of permitted, limited, and not permitted buckets of uses that we're talking about.
Thanks, Megan.
Can I
Alex.
ask a question?
Yep.
Go ahead, Alex.
Charles and Megan, can you tell us about the rationale for putting the limitation on hotels in the district? Like, you had obviously thought about it and, had a
Yeah.
reason for putting that in there. So, I mean, because I think it fundamentally changes the character of the neighborhood. And we heard good arguments on both sides. And the one little
Yeah.
comment I was going to make when I raised my hand earlier was that some of that hotel use for whether it's for tourism or business will be taken up by people Airbnb-ing their new 350 square foot apartments that are going to be built.
Yes, Alex, this has been probably one of the topics we've had, the most discussion about internally, at least. And I think the general concern with hotels is that it's very easy to imagine, Eve's just mentioned, the amenities that are already taking place and will be taking place in the South End. It's easy to imagine the South End becoming a tourism hub, a center for tourism in the city. And so I think that limiting those uses was our attempt, or is our attempt, to prevent that from happening. There was also some opinion that downtown should remain the destination for hotels and tourists in the city. It's not too far from the South End. It's a quick bike ride. It's walkable from downtown to the South End and the core of the Innovation District. And so I think those were the two main points that, opponents of allowing hotels and other hospitality uses have raised. But like Michael and Eves have said, we also heard the other side that supports these uses in some way to really support that office economy, really, and some of the uses that are happening elsewhere.
Thank you.
So yeah, we'll move along. Any final comments? We can treat those now or later on land use, but similar to the discussion on land use, we've sort of broken down the subtopics of the urban form content. And these, apologies, do not align exactly with the way the amendment is written, but we will present them in a way that tries to adhere closely to what you see in your agenda packet. So we'll start at the beginning. The red text that you see, the district specific regulations. So there's the table that in your packet begins on page 11 and goes into page 12. So we're proposing an FAR approach, a floor area ratio approach, maximum 2.5. We've gone back and forth about whether or not FAR is the right way to go, and ultimately have proposed FAR as a regulating tool, given that there are a few sites, very large parcels in the Innovation District that are very likely to have new streets developed as the sites are developed themselves. And without the ability to sort of control height based on streets that are existing in much the same way that the form code does, FAR is a tool. It's perhaps a blunt tool that we can use to sort of regulate the expanse of development in the Innovation District. We've modeled out proposals, different scenarios of development on a few sites in the Innovation District to see what FAR may be. Just to give you an idea, an FAR of 2.5 on 125 Lakeside would likely support, upwards of 500, 600 residential units with, 50,000 square feet of office and a very large amount of parking, potentially in a structure. On some of the smaller sites in the Innovation District, it could easily support, a couple large apartment buildings, 100 to 200 apartment units. So we're feeling very confident that an FAR of 2.5 achieves the density goals the community has for the Innovation District. Related, we're proposing a maximum building footprint, and this is really to preserve a little bit more permeability in the district, more connectivity to ensure that blocks are developed in a way that provides, multiple transportation routes for people on foot and on bike, particularly, to make sure that the area is dense and urban, but perhaps not quite as dense and with a fully complete street wall as you see downtown. It's really meant to, promote what you see in this image from Malmö, Sweden, which is a very sort of dense yet still ecologically sustainable and supportive urban district. We are proposing that taller buildings up to 8 stories have a limited building footprint or floor plate on floors 7 and 8 only. Megan alluded to this being sort of a form code light. We're not really dictating where step backs have to happen on floors 7 and 8. We're simply saying that the floor plate has to be smaller. So a developer may not step back on floors 7 and 8 on each side. They may decide to step it back fully on one side, which, as you can imagine, could create some fairly generous rooftop open spaces, amenities for building users or the public. We are proposing exceptions to that floor 7 and 8 floor plate standard for buildings that are constructed with mass timber or to passive house standards. There are additional green building standards that we've considered. Would love to hear a conversation about that if folks feel strongly about it. But the rationale here is that Passive House, as compared to something like LEED, is definitely more flexible for designers. It really gets at the city's goal of reducing energy use in buildings and is probably the best way to ensure the livability and air quality of buildings, taller, bigger buildings in the district. But again, would love to hear anybody's thoughts on Passive House versus LEED or generally this approach. I will say though, I'll talk about height in just a moment, but there has been a lot of support when we have discussions with the community about having this mix of heights and having this sort of block form that does allow folks to sort of enter into the interior of blocks and have multiple options in terms of traversing through the district. So again, yep, Michael.
Sorry, I was just wondering if you had thoughts about, you know, street locations, what your assumptions were in those build outs, assuming 2.5 FAR, and if there's, I mean,
let me skip down ahead just a few slides. And so this is a map that we're proposing, or a similar map, to regulate a number of forum topics: ground floor use, the amount of a block that has to be occupied by buildings, similar issues. Initially, we contemplated where new streets could be proposed, and thought a lot about how we could, you know, think about for example, a new street running north-south through 68 Sears Lane, the city's property, and 125 Lakeside. I don't know if you can see my cursor here. Looks like you can. So we've imagined a north-south sort of spine running through the middle of the Innovation District, through 68 and 125, and then crossing over Lakeside and continuing north through the very large surface parking lot behind the Innovation Center. And similarly, constructing a grid of east-west streets that would create a grid structure of roughly 400 by 400 square foot blocks, much like we have downtown. We ultimately decided not to try and prescribe where those streets would go to preserve flexibility for individual developers. The sort of final solution for that was to say that upon development and development of a site plan, developers should be allowed and would be required actually to say which of these new streets are their primary frontages and which are secondary. And so let's say, you know, there is a development on one of these lots and there is a north-south spine street developed. It would be up to that developer or property owner to determine whether or not that's a primary street or secondary street for the purposes of some of these ground floor use and lot occupation standards. We had thought about using a similar map for building height. And you probably recall or know that the Downtown Form Code has a specific height area map, which does dictate building height based on location upon certain streets. And so City Place is an example of a building site that is afforded heights up to 14 stories based on its location. There are other locations downtown where height is limited to shorter heights. And we had thought about a similar approach, but again, just not knowing where exactly new streets will be, we didn't want to be too prescriptive with this. But again, with the establishment of primary and secondary streets, and with the establishment of an FAR, we do feel like we will achieve probably a result that is approaching what we would have, you know, set forth had we implemented that type of math.
Thank you. That's really helpful background.
So yeah, again, back to 8 stories. If you had a chance to come to the public meetings or look at our Miro boards that we used in our public meetings, again, just very broad support for a mix of building heights up to 8 stories. We would love to see buildings used as mitigation against noise and air pollution. This is increasingly a common approach in Europe, and it's gaining traction in North America. It's trying to balance the need for density along high traffic corridors while also acknowledging that those high traffic corridors produce more noise pollution and air pollution that is harmful to the users of those buildings. And so to the extent that taller buildings can be located along streets like Champlain Boulevard or Champlain Parkway and Pine Street, they could help to keep the interior of the Innovation District and also open spaces like the Barge Canal and the rest of the waterfront more free and clear of those air pollutants and noise pollution.
Charles,
Yes.
I don't recall, is the Champlain Parkway being developed, the road itself being developed in a way that would allow for buildings to come up, alongside it and for, give access to parking and all of that? I thought it was more of a limited access, but it's changed so many times I don't actually recall how
No,
it is right now.
you're right, Andy. It is envisioned as a limited access parkway, especially south of Lakeside Avenue. As the parkway sort of veers on to Pine Street and that sort of combined street is re-envisioned, it sort of takes on a different character. But yes, it is a limited access road between the highway and Lakeside Avenue. And specifically in this stretch of the Innovation District between Sears Lane and Lakeside Avenue, it is bounded on its edges by what I would call a fairly generous buffer of lawn today. There are street trees drawn in the plans and the concept plans. There will likely be some shade trees planted alongside the parkway.
But, I raise that, not being critical actually of what you're saying, but maybe being critical of the Champlain Parkway design, that I think the way you're laying it out here to say, the city's building a new road going through what's going to now become, like, what we're trying to create is a whole new center for the city, a whole new area for the city. And to have a limited access road going through there, I think what you're proposing might make a lot more sense. And if that's the case, does anything need to change? I mean, how would we make sure that what you're proposing here is something that would be viable with the new road that's being?
Yeah, I know that I'm really glad you phrased that extra point. The caveat to what I said earlier is that upon completion of the parkway in 2027, the city will take control of Champlain Parkway. And there's no commitments today to revise ultimately how that streetscape is developed. There's no commitments from the city today to say, yes, we're going to come in 2027 with an expanded sidewalk and multi-use path and more of an urban streetscape feel. It's possible, though, that could happen. There is potential that some of these sites could develop through coordination with developers, and those are conversations that could be had at that time. There have been conversations about whether or not the parkway could or should remain limited access. For example, should new streets be able to plug in to the parkway? We've heard from some of our colleagues at DPW that a number of streets were closed actually in the creation of the alignment for the parkway. And so it would be a bit of a conflict to then go back and propose new streets. But yes, I think you can imagine how a sort of revised streetscape approach on Champlain Parkway could produce and engender, a more pedestrian, bicycle friendly feel.
Yeah, the Champlain Parkway has its roots going back, 40, 50, 60 years. And what we're doing here is envisioning the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, and, oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just finishing up on that. I'd hate to be restricted in our visioning based on views from the 1960s and 1970s. So sorry about cutting you off, Megan.
No, I cut you off, Andy. I'm sorry. That is actually, Charles mentioned a couple things that you have brought up questions about that we've also spent a lot of time talking about, and this is another one of them. And ultimately, I think what Charles has tried to frame here is the opportunity for some flexibility, given some of the things that are unknowns about how the parkway could evolve in the future. But I think even looking at this, these photos that Charles has on this slide, you can see how some of these activation, building placement and some of the activation concepts that he has been thinking through here could benefit multiple kind of settings in terms of how development could be located along the parkway. So obviously the top image is envisioning more of a classic street where buildings are kind of right along a sidewalk along a street's edge. But some of the buildings in the lower image are also kind of along a promenade along a canal. And so I think even being adjacent to a large landscape buffer where buildings may not directly front on a curb, there are opportunities for some activation and the creation of kind of vibrant public spaces that I know Charles has really been trying to embrace in thinking about some of these standards.
That's
Thanks.
right. Yeah, in addition to using building height to mitigate some of those pollution impacts that I mentioned, landscape, specifically shade tree plantings, can achieve the same thing. So yes, along the parkway, you can imagine a very urban yet still very green frontage to some of that development. And so ultimately, it'll be up to the developer, but these are standards that we're hope will sort of engender that type of urban form.
I have a question for Charles.
Yeah.
Just how do you, in zoning, encourage a mix of building heights? So like you'd have taller buildings along, major streets and shorter elsewhere. I like the idea. I'm just wondering how it's like, how you get there.
Yeah, so lacking, that street grid today, like we have downtown, and not having the ability to say, well, on this street, we want 8 stories, and on this street, we want 6 stories. FAR and building footprint a little bit are the ways, are the tools that we can use to regulate that. So we're allowing 8 stories really anywhere, but establishing an FAR of 2.5 will limit the extent to which buildings can be 8 stories. So that's really the way that we would do that.
I think if I could just add on to that, Alex, I think just from our experiences over the last, certainly since I've been engaged in this for a number of years, developers may say one thing at one point, but when it actually comes time to develop, we've allowed all sorts of different things and heights, and it's rare where they actually meet the height limits. And so I think, it's almost site by site where the developer decides what they're going to do. So, whatever we decide for a height, odds are when people come in to actually develop, it will be a total mix up to that amount. And we'll be lucky if we get that amount, if that's what we want. They just develop whatever heights they that they have financing for, they have the land, the land supports and all of their other factors. But it's very rare where I've seen that they actually hit the maximum limits. They do sometimes, but mostly not.
But this is another area we've talked a lot about too. And we did go back and forth. I think Charles had mentioned that map he showed earlier that really emphasized the Parkway and Pine Street. We had debated whether a more specific height area map could or should be utilized in this area to further limit and differentiate the different height standards. But we struggle with this a lot, just given the sites in this part of the city are so unique in that they're so large, and they could potentially facilitate a number of buildings Unlike when we talk about taller buildings in the city, usually we're talking about downtown lots that are really just one building. And so we really struggled with how to kind of get that right in terms of facilitating variation without overly constraining the future potential of these sites. So appreciate the question and happy to hear any other takes if the commission has them as well.
Thank you for that. Just, I had a really lighthearted thought, which was that we should have an emergency design charrette to reimagine Champlain Parkway, preferably at midnight. But there's a lot of exhaustion on some of these issues, like that. Champlain Parkway has been talked about for 30 years, and the city has a plan and they're clearing land, they're going to build it. But it just seems kind of nuts to have what essentially is a 25-mile-an-hour highway going through the middle of a new development. And this whole plan for this district didn't exist when the city finalized its plans for Champlain Parkway. It does seem to cut off a lot of flexibility. Or
Bruce, were you wanting to?
I have to leave. I have to pick up my son, but I just wanted to make one comment / question about, has any consideration been made into making this a designated area under Act 250 for priority housing? I think it's a real problem for people trying to predict development. It essentially just repeats the process and exposes developers to folks laying in wait for a long time and then appealing.
We have talked about this actually a lot, and the new Assistant Director of Community Works, Samantha Dunn, that you've met at some of your meetings, this was one of the first questions she asked when she first started with the city back in December. We have very few tools available to us in the city to designate those areas. It's primarily through what's called the Downtown and Village kind of growth designation program. We do have both a downtown and a neighborhood designation in the city already, which conveys some kind of limited Act 250 review benefits to developments in those areas of the city. We have talked about whether or not we could potentially be eligible to add on kind of a highlighted designation for the South End area. And it's something that we are trying to explore at the city. It would be a very big lift, but we're trying to explore it. And I think the process that we're going through right now to reconsider the zoning for this area could help our chances that that district may be successful, because those districts are really intended to help facilitate the future growth of communities, including residential development. So we've never been eligible to have one in this area before because residential uses were never permitted.
I think you're right. I think it is possible. Some of the designations include, future neighborhood development zones. And anyway, I think it's the thing with housing in such a robust demand, you'd think people would be running to build more housing. But the uncertainty, particularly when you layer on another level of uncertainty and another year and a half of planning with Act 250, really will mean this will take a lot longer to build out. And you'll have a lot less folks being able to make an attempt at it.
Thanks, Bruce. Okay, I'm gonna speed this up a bit. Pervious area. So today the lot coverage standard is 80%, and we're essentially proposing to keep that the same, but add on a layer specifically addressing what that pervious area has to look and feel like. So we're saying that you're still allowed up to 80% lot coverage, but 25% of that remaining 20% of your site has to be occupied by GSI. So we've coordinated some of this work with our stormwater folks at DPW, and they have some specific recommendations for types of GSI that are, I think, best suited to the landscape conditions in this area. So constructed wetlands, suspended pavement, silvicells is another term, and pervious pavement are the three primary types of GSI. I don't think we would necessarily limit this, and ultimately we'll probably want to conclusively sort of determine what exactly DPW would like to see in these GSI devices, but that is the minimum standard that we're proposing. We're also proposing an alternative compliance where you're allowed up to 90% of lot coverage if all of your remaining 10% of your site consists of those GSI devices. And this is really not just to increase the capacity of the stormwater infrastructure, but it is meant to enhance the sort of biodiversity and ecological performance of the innovation district. Haven't said yet, but we've said it before that the lake, Barge Canal, and Inglesby Brook are on 3 sides of the innovation district. And it's really important that this district develop in a way that supports the quality of the water and the species that live in and around those areas. Setbacks, very straightforward.
Charles, there was a question from
Yep.
Michael.
Oh yeah, so I just wondered how so again, we're back to streets, but the intent of the streets to be publicly owned or privately owned, would they be a part of the lot coverage?
Great question. So we're proposing, in the ideal scenario, that new streets would become city right-of-way and would therefore not be counted in lot coverage upon development. In the event that there are private streets, it's those, I think, standards are a little bit unclear. Megan, if you have specific ideas related to private streets and how they would be counted or not.
Yeah, no, I think if a private drive is on a private lot and not offered to the city as a public street, it would count as lot coverage. So it would factor into that 80% limit.
Again, setbacks, no surprise, want to allow flexibility for a very urban environment, but allow a little bit more flexibility perhaps than there is downtown, allow a little bit deeper setback for some of those more generous sort of landscape approaches. So frontage build out. So this is the sort of amount of a linear block face that has to be occupied by buildings. And we're proposing on streets that are determined to be primary. So in the map that we're showing to regulate this, this would be Champlain Parkway and Pine Street. Ideally, though, some new streets developed in the district would also have that primary designation where the frontage would meet 80%. On secondary streets, it's still fairly high at 70%. So these images are just sort of examples, precedent images of how a district can simultaneously be very urban, yet retain some permeability for connectivity for pedestrians and cyclists and air quality, that sort of thing. So again, hoping to produce this kind of urban form with these standards. And just a diagram to sort of illustrate what 80% and 70% looks like and what that 15,000 square foot building footprint could produce. So with a 15,000 square foot footprint would allow what is conventional in North America, double loaded corridor, sort of podium building up to, I think, about 100 and upwards of between 150 and 200 feet long. Obviously, if you've got a narrower building with maybe dual aspect and cross ventilation for residents, you can go a bit longer. But on primary streets, you're still with that 20% retaining a good bit of sort of permeability, and obviously 70% allows that as well. So ground floor uses, we've spent a lot of time on ground floor uses, and there's actually a good bit of content on ground floor uses in the district, but want to recognize that across the country and North America, there is just a great amount of vacant ground floor space in cities. Many cities have required that new urban development have that ground floor non-residential use, and it has frankly resulted in some very poorly performing retail and commercial spaces. And so we want to sort of balance that reality with also the need to create non-residential uses in the district to generate street level activity, to create a really livable sort of amenity rich district. So, you know, we start out with some minimum depth standards for that non-residential space. And so 25 feet is actually very shallow. I think ultimately, I just mentioned, you know, the very common form of development is, you know, typically 70 feet or more of 70 feet deep or more of podium building with, you know, 70 feet or so of a double or a corridor apartment building on top. Those would obviously have retail or non-commercial, non-residential spaces that are deeper than 25 feet, but we wanted to provide some flexibility, and even down to 10-foot depths. I think there are many great examples of very small non-residential uses. You can imagine cafes, you know, kiosks, that sort of thing, built into buildings that are very shallow. And so that's generally what we're hoping to allow for in the district. Also proposing that building corners should include active and non-residential uses. You know, this is a fairly time-tested, you know, urban design concept that building corners should accentuate the uses in an urban district. And also by placing those uses in the corner, you can help to sort of mitigate their impacts on nearby residences. So on primary streets in this map, those are the orange streets, so Champlain Parkway, Pine Street, but again, hopefully on some internal new streets, we're proposing that a minimum of 80% of any ground floor should be occupied by non-residential uses. There's big caveats coming, so hold on to your thoughts. And a minimum of 20% on secondary frontages or 500 square feet, whichever is greater in each building. We are proposing that these standards can be reduced upwards, you know, from 80% to as low as 30% on those primary frontages, and eliminated completely on secondary frontages. Had a lot of conversations internally and with stakeholders about, you know, whether buildings that are completely residential are appropriate in this district. And I think we've seen many great precedents in this presentation and elsewhere how completely residential buildings are in no way incompatible with a really urban sort of form and feel of a district. And we hope that there is a good mix, but we wanted to allow some flexibility here with these non-residential use requirements. Again, reflecting on that sort of problem of vacancy and non-residential uses across the country.
Charles,
Yes.
how would you go from like the at least 80% has to be non-residential down to 30%? What would the standards be?
We're proposing 4 different alternative compliance standards that I'll get to in just a minute, Andy. So if you will, I'll just speak real quickly.
That's fine.
This essentially is just a diagram that illustrates what that looks like for each building. So on that secondary street, it might just be a small corner cafe or a small entrance into a daycare. And on the primary street, a much larger sort of expanse. Andy, to answer your question, these next 4 slides talk about the standard, or at least 4 slides talk about exemptions to those standards and what those alternative compliance measures are. So when a developer agrees to maintain affordable non-residential uses on the ground floor as affordable for 30 years, they can have that requirement reduced from 80% to 30%. So if there's a childcare center, for example, and the developer agrees to keep their rent at an affordable rate for 30 years, they would then be able to reduce that amount of non-residential space. Another way that we propose to allow some flexibility is through the creation of detached non-residential spaces within the district located in the public realm on the site. So these images are just 2 examples of what that might be, and want to stress that these will be permanent structures. So not talking about food trucks coming in on the weekend. We're really talking about anything from, you know, permanently placed containers to, you know, structures 1 or 2 stories that are very permanent, you know, existing in a park or in a plaza or in the streetscape. This is a way potentially to help create some smaller spaces that are non-residential with similarly reduced rents for non-residential users.
Charles?
Yeah.
I'll just say that the upper image of the container,
Yes.
I just don't imagine that fitting in down there, but
Okay.
that might just be my opinion.
Sure. No, that is appreciated. Yeah, you know, we don't want to dictate form too much, but point is taken. Both of these images happen to be from Europe, but we do have some examples of similar types of detached commercial uses that we can share at our next meeting.
Another example, if you could imagine a very local context, is the little Lunig's coffee stand on
Yeah.
Church Street. So these could take lots of different forms.
Yeah, that's right.
I think it
Good.
looks cool.
Mhm.
It's
Alex?
a pretty industrial look, but could be cool.
Yeah, so how this might work, you don't have to go all the way down to 30%. If a building, take this middle building here, they want to reduce their requirement a little bit by 500 square feet. If they build a detached structure, perhaps in a park or a plaza across the street, internal to their larger site, they can have that reduced in their building. By providing publicly accessible open space on the same lot, adjacent to or even on roofs of buildings, a developer can reduce that requirement. We do want to require that these open spaces are a minimum size, so 4,000 square feet with a minimum dimension of 10 feet. To make sure they're usable and accessible is the standard, but these are again 2 examples of you know, one being very urban and one a little bit more sort of open and green of approaches that might work in this scenario. The final one is through the provision of family size units in a residential building, a developer can reduce their requirement. And so this is a standard that we've seen from other cities. You know, this standard is essentially identical to one from the city of Toronto that has experienced a problem that I think every city in North America has. And new apartment construction, the vast majority of units are studio and 1 bedroom. And a lot of this has to do with the double loaded corridor and the efficiency of those buildings and the difficulty in creating truly family size units. But it's trying to create a market for family size units. So 25%, if 25% of a building's units are family size, so 10% 3-bedroom, 15% 2-bedroom, that ground floor use requirement can be reduced to 30% on primary streets and completely on secondary streets. Ground floor entries, the images do not change, but we're proposing that there be an entry on the ground floor every 60 feet throughout the district. And again, this is essentially to make sure that the public realm and the ground floor of the district is active. The final component of this amendment is parking. Some of these standards essentially are identical to what are in the form code, but some are a bit different. Proposing that there be permitted a very small amount of also very small surface parking lots. And this is mainly to ensure accessibility within the district. Want to make sure that folks who truly do need a car, whether or not those are folks with mobility challenges or pregnant individuals, making sure that they can move through and access the different spaces within the district. Proposing that any parking structures should be screened or must be screened by buildings either, office space, residential space, or with architectural or vegetative structures. So public art, other types of architectural screening, or green walls, that sort of thing. And that actually concludes the presentation about the zoning amendment. We've got about 15 minutes until 8:30. So Andy, if you want to open it up to conversation.
Yeah, if anybody has any, well, first of all, Charles, thank you for that. That was a very informative presentation with lots and lots of information in it. So thanks for putting all that together. Does anybody have any questions or comments on it?
Well,
Michael?
So, I just want to say congratulations to all of you. Like, the first draft of this is like really remarkable. I think it's, as Megan said, you're threading the needle on so many themes, and I'm sure it's going to get revised at the margins to be fine tuned, but it's really impressive.
Anyone else?
And I'll give props to Charles. I know he's dived right in on this as he came into working with the city, and he's brought a lot of expertise from other places he's worked that has really helped move the needle on this conversation. So thanks for recognizing that, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
I do have a couple thoughts.
Go ahead, if you have.
Yeah, sure. So I already gave my more substantive thought on the land use question, which I think is the only thing that's, super material. But just a few observations. I think speaking of remote workers and people commuting to places on the Acela corridor, ran into somebody who recently works remotely for USGBC. I think, we may quabble with their model, but it is kind of a market acceptable or market understood designation. So I kind of would advocate for that. And then the other thing I was thinking about, and again, I know you're grappling with the fact that you haven't defined the streets, but just wearing my old hat, thinking about the Pearl District in Portland, Oregon, and the 200-foot blocks, and the 90% or 80% requirement, and given that the streets aren't defined. So I wonder, if there might be like a kind of a slider there, if someone does want to define more streets in their development plan, and
Michael?
they are smaller. Yep.
Not to cut you off, but what do you mean when you say the 80 or 90%?
Yeah, so there's a area of Portland, Oregon called the Pearl District. It was like early in Portland sort of accelerated growth, where they have very small block sizes. So Charles mentioned before that ours are about 400. A lot of cities, in Cincinnati, for example, it's 500. There it's 200, and what it gets you to is a very livable scale, because you have buildings. It's not, you don't have as much of a building wall. It's interspersed with blocks you can walk down, and it tends to be, if it's populated, helpful for retail as well. But if you're doing this, if you had a 200-foot, since the developer is ultimately going to define the streets, if they said, hey, we want 200 feet or 250-foot blocks, then you wouldn't necessarily want the 90 or 80%. So, it's just an observation. You're trying to juggle so many things at the same thing. So but just something to think about.
Julia, is your hand raised?
Yes, it is. I also want to say congratulations. That was really amazing to hear about all the progress that's been made. And I feel like that presentation really helped me picture the code come to life. So thank you. I have a couple questions. The packet talks a bit about the role of remediation in redeveloping this area. And I'm wondering what incentives exist in the code amendment or can be added to the code amendment to address that, since so much of the area would be devoted to residential, and even more remediation might be required for those types of uses. So that's one question that I had. The other question I had is about the relationship between art spaces and housing, and if a sort of live work situation or combined studio space and residential space could be enumerated in the code amendment here, if that's appropriate. I'm not sure if that's something that you've discussed. And I thought it was really clever, the balancing that you did with the limited uses and making sure that, certain types of uses don't preclude or, outweigh other uses that are the main intent of the district. And I wonder if something similar could be created to make sure that some of the housing types that are provided do serve those artistic residents and employees in that area, since this is both like innovation in a business sense and also sort of a creative district that's currently home to a lot of artists and artistic spaces. So those are my main questions.
Yeah, and Andy too, I think the other thing that I was just going to offer, just given what time it is like happy to take these questions from the commission too. And these are things that we can also follow up on in a future discussion.
Yeah, I
How do
think,
you think of it? Okay.
yeah, I mean, these are all great questions that are being asked and it is getting late, so we're probably not going to get into a big discussion on them tonight, but these are good, really good placeholders that people are asking. So the next time we have this discussion, that is where we'll pick it up from. So thanks. And Alex, do you have?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate Charles and Megan's work, because this feels like planning. Like, how often do you get the chance to actually plan a whole new part of an old city? So thank you.
Just Julia, back to close out what you were saying. When we have our next meeting on this topic, these issues will come up. And so just try and remember the questions that you asked, make sure they're being answered to the way you want them to be answered, that they don't get forgotten, but hopefully they'll come up again.
And I'm also keeping track of them, so don't worry. We'll make sure that we start with answering your questions.
Anyone else? Oh, well, this was a really good, I won't say kickoff to this discussion because we've been having it for a while now, but re-energizing of this discussion. So thanks again for that presentation and for all the work you've been putting into this. So unless there's anything else, we'll close out this discussion for tonight, but expect it to be on our agenda again. I'm not sure exactly when, but sometime soon, I would imagine.
Yeah,
Good.
potentially as recent as your next meeting. Yep.
Okay, good. So with that, we'll move on to the next item, which is committee appointments. And we have the DRB recommending, who is it? Caitlin Halpert for the ordinance committee and Brad Rabinowitz for the long range planning committee. Do we need to take action on that, or are they the ones who are doing that?
Yeah, I mein, it's sort of a formality, but in the past you have just taken a vote to approve them as your committee members.
Okay. Is there a motion to approve them as a committee members? Alex? You're on mute, but I think I read your lips saying that you make the motion to approve them.
Yes, please.
Good. Is there a second? Seconded by Emily. Any discussion on this?
Andy, really quickly, one thing that you did not do at your annual meeting was appoint another member of the Planning Commission to your own ordinance committee. In part, some of the Planning Commission members weren't there, and we also wanted to wait now that we have Julia, we wanted to wait to offer an opportunity for other commissioners to consider whether or not they would want to join the ordinance committee. So I don't know if before you take this vote, if anyone would like to amend the motion to add another ordinance committee member.
So we need one more committee member from the Planning Commission to the ordinance committee.
That's
and if
correct.
it's helpful, the ordinance committee meets the first Thursday of every month. So we'll actually be having a meeting next week on Thursday, if that helps.
Good. Is there anyone, well, Julia, you're one of the main people, but is there anyone who's not on a committee who'd like to serve on the ordinance committee?
Alex, didn't you want to be on the ordinance committee?
I deferred to you, Emily, just like I did last time. I thought we had,
I think you have an opportunity to.
we
I think
had,
you have it
because
all.
Eves wasn't here last time. Eves, can you hear us? It was Eves, Bruce, and a player to be named later.
That's right.
I can hear you.
Do you,
Yves, you want to be on ordinance committee?
Would you like me to be on ordinance committee?
Megan, who's on right now? You?
As far as who was the previous ordinance committee?
Who's on it? Did we appoint any? We did appoint people to it, didn't we?
Yeah, we've got Bruce and Emily from the
Okay.
commission, and yep, Caitlin Halbert.
Alex,
Yep.
you want to be on the ordinance committee, is that correct? You just were being.
I'm here to
thoughtful.
serve. So Eves, the answer to your question is yes.
What's yes, that you want me to be on the ordinance committee? Okay, I'll
Yes,
do it.
I want you to be on
Sure.
ordinance.
Oh, I thought, okay, Alex, I thought you wanted to. you
He's good
wanted
at
to
it.
be on.
So am I nominating myself?
I think
No,
whoever
I'm
can commit
nominating
to
Yves
being on the
Bradley.
ordinance committee should.
Alex is
should
nominating
commit.
you.
Okay. And could we be reminded of who's on our long range planning committee?
Yeah. Give me 1 second. Do you have the committee list pulled up, Charles?
I do not. I'm sorry. I have the ordinance committee list pulled up.
Okay, give me 1 second. I know Brad Rabinowitz has offered to be on it.
From the commission.
All right, I think it's this meeting here.
Might be in our minutes.
Yeah, that's what I was actually looking for. 1 second. Okay, so long range committee is Michael. Andy volunteered as a member of the executive committee, and Alex volunteered as an at-large member of the planning commission.
And are our committees set at just 3 members each? Because it would be good if we could to have Julia on one of them.
Your bylaws, I believe, are in the packet, right, Charles?
They should be, yes. Yes, they are. I think it is established.
And one of the, well, I guess they're warned public meetings, but I was going to say one of the reasons probably is to avoid having a quorum of the full planning commission.
That
We can
makes
just
sense.
check really fast. You would think after all these years of doing
I have
this.
the language.
Thank you.
It's no more than
At
5.
least 4, no more than 5.
Okay,
That's total, isn't it? That's not,
That's
that-
total. Yeah,
Because then it would just be a planning commission meeting.
that's right.
okay.
2 at-large planning commissions to the ordinance committee.
that's correct.
And
And
same with the long range.
planning.
Yes, and no more than 5. That's correct.
Okay.
So for each of them, that is what you usually try to do, is a member of the executive committee and 2 at-large members.
Does a member of the executive committee need to serve on one of the committees, on each of the committees?
Yes.
Okay. All right, then we will sort it out later, Julia, to figure out how to get you engaged on a committee. But even if you're not formally on one, you're still welcome to go to them, which I think is a good way to also be introduced to what we're doing.
That's great. Thank you.
And the commission reassigns these committees every year, so that's another thing to just keep in mind. So, cool.
Yes. So we have, I believe, an amended motion to appoint Caitlin to the ordinance committee as a DRB rep, to appoint Brad to the long range planning committee as the DRB rep, and to appoint Eves to the ordinance committee as a member of the planning commission. Do I have anything else here? Are folks ready for this, to vote on this? All right, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? We have our new committee structure in place. Thank you all. Next item is commissioner items. Our next meeting is June 13th, and as Megan said at the beginning of this meeting, we're going to try to do the Trinity campus site visit during the beginning of that meeting as well. Any other commissioner items? Okay, seeing none. Next item is minutes and communication. Is there a motion to accept the minutes or to approve the minutes and accept the communications?
I move that we accept the minutes and approve the communications, or the other way around.
But that's okay. Motion by Alex, seconded by who's seconding this? Julia? Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand. Aye. Any opposed? We have our minutes and communication, and final item is adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion by Emily, seconded by Michael. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye or raise your hand. Aye. Perfect, and we stand adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank
This was
you.
a great meeting, and look forward to our next.
Thanks so much for all your engagement tonight.
Thank you.
Alrighty, take care. Good night.
Night.
Night.